What's going on? You listening to King Cam's and Ujumbe's podcast. Ujumbe means message. And today's message is a book review. Yeah, a book review. The World in Africa by Dr. W.E.B.Du Bois. This was a book review that I made years ago when I was in college, but I figured dealing with the concept of Pan-Africanism and unity, this is a good start. I believe that anybody who wants to study and do the work of African unity should look into this book, The World in Africa by W.E.B.Du Bois. It's a very powerful work, to say the least. To order this book, for me, it was a life changer. It was just $8 back then, and it was paperback. It was very solid, and it should be a required reading for all African history or people of the diaspora. Whether it's high school, college, I think anybody should and everyone should read this. Dr. Du Bois speaks very truthfully from the heart about the plight of Africa as a civilization, wanting it to be recognized as such. To the reader, the world in Africa goes hand in hand with the destruction of Black civilization by another great author, Chancellor Williams, both of which points out how Africans have been mistreated over the centuries and abused. And Dr. Du Bois brings up the transatlantic slave trade and how Africa spoon-fed both Europe and America in its early stages or its rebirthing process. Du Bois points out that Africa, as well as Asia, gave Europe a jumpstart, the jumpstart it needed. Now let's remember, if we think back, Africa gave Europe at least three major jump starts. Okay, the Romans, okay, Egypt, Kemet taught Rome. Let me go back. Kemet taught the Greeks. Once they became who they were, the only reason why they became who they were was because of the knowledge of Kemet. And once Greece fell to Rome, Rome took its place and they taught them again. Then you had this thing called the Renaissance. Where did they come from? What did this Renaissance is? It makes it sound as if they was already arrived and just briefly lost it. No, they had the Dark Ages. They totally forgot the knowledge of Kemet, and they made reading illegal, and so therefore they had the Dark Ages. So we had the Renaissance period. Why? Because the Moors occupied Spain and major parts of Europe, educating along the way. Keep in mind that Moors were not just Muslim, that was a generic term for Africans. So they occupied Europe and Spain for over 700 years, building universities and houses of knowledge. And then once Spain got on its feet, then they crossed the Atlantic. How? By the aid of Africans. Now the third, what do you mean third? So we had the Greco-Roman period, then we had the Middle Ages, then we had the European slave trade, which gave birth to the United States of America. So we had three. Africa had to jumpstart Europe as well as the world at least 3 times. So gave this final push gave Europe, the European world, the Western world, the jumpstart it needed because of Africa's wealth and labor during the slave trade, the proceeds of which was to fund the restoration as well as the Renaissance, as well as other reformation. How can you have time to have religious arguments and discussions if you had nothing else to do? In which they had nothing else to do. They was done with the Crusades, so they was able to write treaties and papers on why this group was not theologically correct. So they had that kind of time. Why? Because they enslaved so many. So in addition, America would not be the country, a superpower, so-called superpower, is if it was not for the enslaved Africans. Now, Du Bois, he opens up masterfully, dealing with, of course, Europe and the Americas, the collapse of Europe, And they were collapsing, dealing with these series of wars, so many to count. We had the Spanish-American War, we had World War I and World War II, and so on. But then he leads into the white masters of the world. How did they become, or how did they develop this concept that they were the masters of the world? Well, it came from the doctrine of as he mentioned, the superior race theory. Europe assumed that war and poverty was good for their nations. So in order to get what they wanted and do what they wanted, they used the means of war to do it. Okay? And he mentioned by way of thinking, gave rise to many paradoxes. And it was, and I quote on page 17, the characteristics of the era that men did not face paradoxes which any plan to solve them. So there was the religious paradox, the contradiction between the golden rule and the use of force. So on one hand, you had the Bible, but on the other hand, you had a rifle. That's not how this thing goes. That's not how it should go. And there was an assumption that the absolute necessity of poverty for the majority of men in order to save civilization for the minority, which he meant that it's okay for 2/3 of the planet Earth to be poor and disenfranchised, whereas the European minority, as long as they're on top, they're fine. But he touches on the European, the boundless growth of greed by way of worldwide organization and agricultural crops. How did they get this greed? How is it fed? By mass production, by mass enslavement, by furthering, say, the cause and thoughts of ideas of manifest destiny. And then how did they use what was this concept of racial superiority? They used the Bible. They used the concept of the curse of Ham. Okay, so they said, okay, we're better than you because the Bible says so. Once again, they're misreading it, but that's what they used. They wanted to use it to further their greed. They used the Bible, propaganda, and slavery became a factory system. The word, and even the word Negro, was used for the first time during this time to separate the races, to tie color with inferiority, to tie color with slavery. So they used the color phenomenon, even though some of the original Greeks, the people that they loved the most, pointed out that, the Ethiopians had a high culture, but it didn't matter to them. They wanted to prove their point that these people of blackness and black hue or darker hue were inferior. And the good book says so, and we have weapons to show and prove we are better. So with the idea of the superior race, the U.S. and Europe grew. And this concept fueled their fire. And this is what W.E.B.DuBois was talking about. On one hand, you have poverty, on the other hand, you have prosperity. And these ideas carried out to not just races, but gender, because we know that the Europeans did not respect their women, so the treatment of their females was even base and debauched. So the reason for this world mastered by Europe was rationalized as a natural and inborn superiority of white people, showing itself not only in the loftiest of religions, but in the technical mastery of forces of nature, which means I could knock down this mountain and have an image of some European or imperialist or whatever, and you guys should be fine. This is what he's talking about, the white masters of the world in this chapter 2. And they got their power. How? By murder. But here's the thing. When they pushed further into Africa, there was an element in Africa, or groups in Africa, that was united, and they fought the imperialists. Even further into South Africa, dealing with Chaka Zulu and many others, they was fighting back. But the Europeans discovered a mineral called diamonds, and that was it. Once they discovered the African diamond, that was a wrap. And the rape of Africa, which is chapter 2 chapter 3 began. That's when you had the Berlin Conference. That's when he mentions how many thousands and thousands of dollars was taken from Africa, whether it's by cash or by minerals. And once they took the people, then they took the minerals, and Africa was, as he mentioned, raped. And he said, at this point, the raping of Africa was so horrendous that you was basically killing the goose that laid the golden egg. That's what he was saying. On page 7, he was saying that, look, your whole supply is about to be destroyed. But then he goes from that to the peopling of Africa, how the Bantu people and people in Kenya and Uganda was making moves and movements and migrations and distributions of the wealth and knowledge was being passed down. And so he moved on, and I like how he did that. I like how Du Bois went from dealing with the immediate problems of Europe and imperialism to shine some light as to why Africa was and still is the beacon of light of the world. He goes into the culture of Africa, the cradle of humanity, and he talks about the different periods and the different ages of even, he goes into like the prehistoric age of different types of human beings. But then he moves into what's familiar to us, to the Bantu people, to the Anu people, to the Batwa people. People he mentions, of course, we can't get upset for Dr. Du Bois for not using the terms that we would use. We won't, we can't fault him for not saying Kemet or Tunisia, Tamari, or things like that. We can't fault him for that. But the facts still remain. The information still remains that Egypt is in Africa, Sudan is in Africa, which is Nubia and Ethiopia, and so on. He goes into the definitions of and why. He goes into the science of the African races as to why these people are lighter without any European involvement, before Europeans came, there was light-skinned people in Africa. So we have a doctor, a sociologist breaking down the science as to the divisions of the African race inside of Africa for European involvement in the people of Africa. In that chapter, he talks about the Songha people. He talks about different hunters and fishermen, different lifestyles. And then he moves on, of course, chapter 5 into Egypt. And he talks about civilization has flowed down to man along the Nile Valley, great rivers, where the soil was fertile, and that man need not fear hunger, and where waters carried him to other peoples who were thinking of problems of human life. So he talks about how the Nile River flowed 4,100 miles. He doesn't go as deep as Dr. Ben. However, he touches on the fact that civilization, the cradle of civilization was and began in the Nile River Valley. And he talks about the different dynasties. Of course, he doesn't go deep as far as naming names and things like that, because this is an overview, ladies and gentlemen. This is an overview of the different groups of people in that area. Then he talks about how the Greeks called the Egyptian the most religious of men. It's interesting. And then he talks about this, the gift of the unusual climate, the dry atmosphere with this baking sun, the chance to preserve what man delineated and carved and built. So Egypt perfected what they learned from Ethiopia and Nubia. And he goes into some of the dynasties, especially the famous 25th dynasty, where Egypt expanded a little bit. Now, he talked about King Pepi and Uni, and of course he mentions Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, some terms that those who study ancient Egyptian history, we're gonna get to it. He mentions the Sphinx and the lion's body and the Negro head entirely carved out of rock, and of course the Sphinx is 10,500 years old, but he doesn't deal with that. We have to understand that some of these authors didn't have this knowledge that we have, but it's a good foundation, ladies and gentlemen. Good foundation. Then he goes into the land of the birth faces, which is, of course, Ethiopia. Chapter 6, Ethiopia, the land of the birth faces. And he uses the table of nations, Genesis 10, and he talks about how the Greeks described them as people with burnt faces. And so we have to understand that even on record, according to the Greeks, Memnon was the king of Ethiopia. Andromeda was black. So he's using this opportunity, not just to talk about Ethiopia, but he's using this opportunity to talk about how the people describe the Ethiopians. And he mentioned major cities, the temple built at Thebes, which was an Ethiopian colony. That had relief representing four quarters. Four quarters now lit the world, Deduan, and many other deities. This is page 137. The Assyrians defeated the forces of Egypt and drove them back. The Ethiopians drove back the Ethiopians until 688 BC, and they came back. So then he moves on. He covers the whole continent. And he talked about the people in North Africa. And then later on, he goes back to Central Africa in the March of the Bantu. So he's not done building on the Bantu people or the Bantu people. So we have to understand that Dr. Du Bois is doing the work that we should be doing. Well, he has done the work. He has laid the foundation that we should be doing. And it says the evident amount of gold extracted from prehistoric Rhodesia or Zimbabwe is indicated in the Hebrew scriptures, page 173, and by ancient stories before the commencement of the Christian era. So the people of the world already knew Africa had gold. So they already knew that this place had wealth. Before the Europeans discovered diamonds in Zulu land in the 1700s, centuries before that, East Africa traveled to Asia, and with their goods and their gold, and they even mined and minted their own money with their own image. Ancient Italian coins of the 3rd and 2nd century had black faces on them. So of course, we know that several East Africans had been enrolled for the army and the ruler of Baghdad, and so he goes on and builds. He goes to various parts of Africa. Then he touches on various parts of the world. And Du Bois gave an unknown Jew. He talked about Andromeda. He talks about the nations of Africa as a unified nation. Okay? Talk about him as, what you will, how you feel about him. But we know that some bigotry has put blinders on the so-called scholars by trying to downplay uh, our worth as a people, even ethnicities, by bringing back and releasing concepts that the original people said that the Africans were black, but then later on, because of racism in the modern era, they made them black. Pan-Africanism is the final point that Du Bois was trying to make. Unity. He wanted for the United States African Americans, as well as in the diaspora, to realize the need to unite with the cause of Africans on the continent. He did give his opinion of the movement of Garvey, as well as his own. The masses of the West Indies were listening to Garvey, but intellectuals were all in Paris, both promoting Africa as a people, as human beings. Du Bois said Pan-Africa socialism seeks the welfare state in Black Africa. In another segment, he proclaims, in the light of maintaining historical data, Pan-Africa will seek to preserve its own past history and write the present account, erasing from literature the lies and distortions about Black folk, which disgrace the last centuries of European and American literature. We need to pay attention. We need to have our own philosophy and our own political agenda. So we have to build our own and do for ourselves. Du Bois also knows how important education is and how future Black people depends on it. Realizing the education system is one-sided in the Andromeda chapter, he says, science has become increasingly not the work of free universities, but the property of organizations for private profit and directed to their objects or the objectives. So he further states, education both in school and out of school is encouraging the economic illiteracy, which keeps the mass of American people from knowing and inquiring just how work is done. These are the sentiments of myself, of the reader as well. Du Bois stresses that education should be top-notch and unbiased in their approach without religious dogma or political agenda in the fine print. Even though he remains neutral in his points of view dealing with democracy and communism concerning Blacks around the world, his final statement should be taken seriously as far as what course they must take. Would it not be wise for the American Negroes themselves to read a few books and do a little thinking for themselves? It's not that I would persuade Negroes to become communist, capitalists, or holy rollers, but whatever belief they reach, let it for God's sake be a matter of reason and not of ignorance, fear, and selling our souls to the devil. That's Dr. W.E.B.DuBois. So this was my book review, my thoughts on the world in Africa. I believe it's recommended for all Black historians, students, free thinkers alike to consider adding it to your library, as well as passing on the love for Africa to other people. Even though Du Bois was a very opinionated person, he shows this in his book, but he's still a true scholar who does not back down for what he believes. Doesn't back down for what he believes that's right. And to defend Africa is a noble thing. Bois was a man of action, even when he, according to Doctor, was too old to plead for the human rights of other people. To him, this was far greater than anything in the world. So he talked in the world, in the book, The World in Africa, by Dr. W.E.B.DuBois. He talked about the European problem, the rape of Africa. He built on Africa as a civilization. Then he moved to Pan-Africanism. What do you think? I think you should check it out. Let me know. All right, this is King Cam and Ujumbe's podcast, Ujumbe Me's Message. And the message is a book review, The World in Africa, by Dr. W.E.B.DuBois. Talk to you later.